Thank you, Candy, and good morning. And it's a wonderful fall morning. We have had some very interesting weather in an interesting election season, and so we hope the weather holds during Election Day. We chose this particular meeting to focus on juvenile justice and reform. We knew that the election was coming. We talked about money in politics last month, and we decided to begin a forward look and talk about bettering our society. And so today we have three very distinguished members of our panel with us, and we've been so fortunate this year that we've had the A-team type of frontline leaders come out and speak to us. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit. I gave them a quiz. I love to give quizzes, and I gave them a little quiz, and I told them that each of them were to tell me a quote that they live by, and then also someone they admire. And I had said that Jesus was out, and so was Moses and Abraham, and I prefer to have a living elected leader. So I'll start, and I'll begin with to tell you a little bit about Betsy, whose real name is Elizabeth, but she goes by Betsy. And she is, I asked her if she was a very brave woman because of the fact that she has been in corrections and began her career as a very young woman working in the men's prison and actually teaching. Her background was music, and I said, that's kind of soothing. However, she continued her career starting out first in Oklahoma, and then her husband is in healthcare, and so she had opportunities to serve in South Carolina, and then eventually we captured her here in Kansas, and she is, the director of corrections. One of the things that I'd asked her, I said, okay, who is the person that you admire? And I honestly didn't see any dark money, but she said John Rubin, pass any hands, and she said also President JFK. She is very devoted. She's a middle child of three girls, and she's devoted to her three grandchildren. And she passionately believes in juvenile justice and this reform that we'll be talking about. What is restorative justice, and is it coddling or correcting? The other member of our panel is Representative John Rubin, representing the great district, District 18, that's my district, in the House. He began in 2011, his term began, and it will end in 2017 in January. At that time, he's going to retire, possibly, but not retire from public life. He will be continue to be very, very active. He got his degree from Boston College and then his JD from Washington University. He has always been involved in law, and he was in the United States Navy. Thank you very much for your service. And he was a judge advocate general in the U.S. Navy. He had a number of things that he put forth for 2012. I'll only list a few of those, but you may recognize them. To promote a vibrant and competitive economy, to also rein in state spending and limit the size of government, to enforce the rule of law, eliminate Kansas taxpayer funding of any non-emergency benefits or services for illegal immigrants, and to maintain and strengthen traditional Kansas values, which was to enact pro-life legislation and policies. He also is one of the persons that served as a committee for this juvenile justice reform and was on the work committee that promoted the ideas that we will hear them speak of. Rounding out our panel is the Honorable Judge Thomas Foster, and he spoke of working with the young people and treating them with respect, but also holding everyone accountable for their actions. And one of the things that, if you looked and had a chance and an opportunity to read your voter, it said that crime hurts a lot. It hurts not only the community, it hurts the victim, and it also hurts the perpetrator. And then what we are charged with is finding a way to really rectify that hurt. and that's what we're going to be hearing about. Judge Foster has the opportunity to work in that 10th District Court, and he was appointed by Bill Graves. He said Bill Graves is one of the persons that he admires because Governor Graves was able and did, he had reasoned judgment. And one of his quotes then is, and it's very good for a judge, is to treat others as you would like to be treated. We are very pleased to have our panel today, to have them explore what in the world is restorative justice and why should we as taxpayers be concerned. Is it going to cost us anything? Is it saving us anything? Is it helping anything? So I'll turn the panel over, and the first speaker is going to be Representative Rubin. Please welcome him.
Thank you, Ann, very much. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate the women voters for sponsoring this forum and actually for all the good, vitally important civic involvement work that you promote in Johnson County. Really greatly appreciate it. I'll step out in front of here. I may have to go back and refer to a couple of notes, but let me begin by saying why I care so passionately about juvenile justice reform. I have for a long time, as Ann mentioned, I have a long career as an attorney in public service, mostly the federal government, before I ran for state office. Since 2013, I've had the privilege of chairing the Kansas House Corrections and Juvenile Justice Committee. And from the beginning, issues surrounding juvenile justice reform have been at the forefront of what I've been interested in and working on in the Kansas House. We did some adult corrections reform measures too, which are important. I'll be happy to discuss those later or individually if you have any questions about it. But today we're focusing on juvenile justice reform. It seems to me that the single best thing that we can do to reduce crime nationally and certainly in the state of Kansas is to address individuals at the earliest opportunity where they have involvement with the criminal justice system, and that is as juveniles. If we do right, we in public service, all of us together citizens, if we do right by these kids when they first run afoul of the law, we have a better chance of ensuring not only a better life for these kids, but greater public safety because they will be less likely to recidivate, to commit additional offenses, either as juveniles or as adults. The single best measure I can think of to reduce the pressures on prison overcrowding, which we are looking at in Kansas and which has reached crisis proportions in some states, is to set these kids out on the right path so that they don't commit crimes as adults. And that has informed a lot of what we've been after. It may or may not surprise you to know that there are certainly some hardcore juvenile offenders who are violent offenders who are threats to public safety. But it is actually a very, very small fraction of all the kids that are involved in the juvenile justice system in Kansas and across the country. In many more cases, kids often as a result of abuse of drugs and alcohol and family problems at home. Those are the three big causes of so many kids' problems. Get involved in misconduct that we categorize as a crime in Kansas. In some cases, wouldn't even be a crime if an adult committed them. We call these status offenses. What status offenses are things like minor possession of alcohol, truancy, things of that nature, that are far too often getting kids involved in the criminal justice system early on. Again, when they haven't really committed any crime that we would recognize as a threat to public safety. And even where they engage in other offenses is often of a nonviolent nature. What we found in my committee, and later working with the work group, which I'm going to address here in just a minute, what we found in Kansas is that far too often the default resolution for these problems was to get kids involved in the criminal justice system as juveniles, and quite often with out-of-home placements. And it seems to me something else. The surest way to take a kid who has made mistakes as a juvenile, and by the way, medical studies have consistently shown that a young person's brain functioning, determining the right, the wrong, and so forth, is not fully formed until we're adults. We're really in our early 20s. But to take a lot of these kids who have done no more than commit status offenses or low-level nonviolent offenses, the surest way to turn them into hardened criminals is to house them with hardened criminals. And we found that we were doing that far too often in Kansas. Our out-of-home placements primarily have done what have been called YRCs, youth residential centers, and then we have 2 juvenile correctional facilities in Kansas, Topeka and Martin. And far too often, the kids were getting involved too deeply in the deep end of the system when there really are better community alternatives. One of the statistics that impressed me early on was, while it is true in Kansas, as across the nation, that overall rates of crime, both adult and juvenile actually, but certainly juvenile crime, is trending downward. There are less juvenile offenses. Kansas had a much higher rate than the national average of out-of-home placements of juveniles, again, in the YRCs or the correctional facilities. And at the same time, we had a much higher rate of juvenile recidivism than the national average. You put those 2 things together, and obviously we weren't doing something right. These out-of-home placements were not effective in rehabilitating these kids and in reducing juvenile crime. So we had to look at alternatives. So representatives of a group, of a criminal justice group within the Pew charitable trusts approached myself and my counterpart on the Senate side, Senator Greg Smith, who's the chair of the Senate Corrections and Juvenile Justice Committee, early in 2015, and asked if we would be interested in sponsoring as legislators and co-chairing a work group to do an in-depth, fact-based, evidence-based analysis of the juvenile justice system in Kansas, where it's working, where it's not working, and recommendations for reform. And out of that suggestion, the Kansas Juvenile Justice Work Group was formed and met throughout all of 2015. On that work group were 4 legislators, myself and Senator Smith as co-chairs, and also 3 judges. Judge Foster was one, that have a lot of experience and heavy dockets in terms of juvenile justice cases. Representatives from the Office of Judicial Administration, Court Services, Kansas Department of Corrections. Terry Williams, the Deputy Secretary for Juvenile Services in the Department of Corrections, was on the work group, and others, and community corrections folks. The Division of Children and Families was represented on the work group. There was a prosecutor on the work group that handles a lot of juvenile cases, and a defense counsel that does the same, and representatives of law enforcement. And I emphasize this because the recommendations, the results of the work group and the recommendations have not been uniformly embraced and accepted across the state yet. We have a hope that they will be, but they haven't yet. Among the objections, among some prosecutors, including some prosecutors here in Johnson County, has been that we didn't consult adequately with those deeply involved in the juvenile justice system, the prosecutors that prosecute these cases. Well, as you can see, prosecutors were represented, not only on the work group, but the work group had subgroups, and we also had what are called stakeholder meetings throughout 2015 with all interested stakeholders. We're talking about juveniles themselves, their families, their parents, prosecutors, defense counsel, other representatives of court services, community corrections, and others throughout the state, so that everybody had a chance to have input. So I would reject the notion that all viewpoints were not heard before the work group formulated its recommendations to the legislature and to the governor. The other reason I would refute those considerations is, and I'm going to get to in just a minute, the recommendations of the work group, is just a real brief overview of some of the most important parts of the legislation, and then we can flesh it out as the discussion continues. But the other important thing to bear in mind about the work group is the recommendations of the work group that form the basis for the legislation, Senate Bill 367, the Comprehensive Juvenile Justice Reform Bill that we enacted this were not things that the work group thought sounded like good ideas or things that, you know, we wanted to suggest and try out. Everything was what we call evidence-based, fact-driven, empirical evidence supported all the recommendations of the work group. So we dug down into the data, into the facts, in Kansas and in other states as well, where juvenile justice reform measures have been enacted, and came to conclusions of what works best based on the evidence, not based on just pie-in-the-sky theories, but on evidence itself. And that formulated the work group. As I said, this happened after the individual work group meetings. We met once a month, and then the subgroups, the stakeholders meetings. As a result of that, all that, we came up with the formulation. The charge of the work group, and I want to read this, that was given to us by Governor Brownback and Supreme Court Chief Justice Lawton Nuss, Senate President Susan Whalen, and House Speaker Ray Merritt, was as follows. In developing proposals for reform, the group's priorities will be to promote public safety, hold juvenile offenders accountable, control taxpayer costs, improve outcomes for youth, families, and communities in Kansas. The work group's recommendations will be used as the foundation for statutory, budgetary, and administrative changes during the 2016 legislative session. And that is, in fact, what happened. So let me, in the time I have left, and I'll try to be very brief about this. The bill is comprehensive. It is very, very large. It would take, frankly, hours to summarize all the reforms recommended by the work group that form the basis for the legislation. But let me give you a few of the highlights. I mentioned that one of the significant issues was our high rate of out-of-home placements in Kansas when it became readily apparent that in this and other states, you get better results to the extent you can by keeping kids closer to home, keeping them in their home communities, at home if possible. Again, if they're nonviolent offenders that don't pose a threat to public safety, keep them in their homes or in their communities in a foster home or in another environment where they can get programs that they need. It would include things like vocational training, certainly drug and alcohol abuse, counseling, and things of that nature, close to home. Those sorts of things are more effective in reducing recidivism instead of sending them off to YRC, a youth residential center, or to a correctional facility. The evidence showed that clearly. So one of the recommendations of the work group, and one other thing we found out about the YRCs is they were uniquely ineffective. They actually made matters worse for the majority of juveniles that went to them. Many of the programs that sometimes programs weren't available at all, depending on which YRC the kids were placed in. And even where they were available, these were, again, community programs that could be as easily accessed from home as they could from the YRC. You're also taking a kid far away from their home environment and their support groups, you know, family support, school, and so forth. Ineffectively, there was a much higher rate of AWOLs from these YRCs than you would expect. And inadequate controls and measures. I won't go into all the details, but the YRCs were shown as being uniquely ineffective, frankly. So the work group recommended, and the legislation as initially drafted, accomplished this, a phase out of the use of YRCs in Kansas by I think it was July 1st, 2018. Politics being what it is, some of the YRCs in the home districts of some of my colleagues, and that was part of the consideration. And also there was a policy consideration. We do have a small subset of juveniles that, for various reasons, based on various evaluations, were not appropriate for placement in the correctional facilities, but still had problems too severe to just return them to their home environment, to their communities. And so that group of kids, we had to have some alternative for. So what the final legislation, compromise legislation after we worked with the Senate on a compromise, did was keep 50 YRC beds in the state as of 2018. And they will continue to be available after that time. And that's a great phase down of the YRC system. Now, the other key component of the phase down of the YRCs is we're saving a tremendous amount of money. We in the state of Kansas taxpayers are paying a lot of money for these YRCs under contract with the providers. And the idea behind the bill is that the savings realized by closing down most of these YRCs is to be reinvested in community programs of the type I described, so the kids can get the kind of treatment they need in their communities, which is demonstrated to be most effective for nonviolent offenders. Now, we all know the legislature, and we all know our current budgetary problems in Kansas. So do I have a high degree of confidence that what we in the legislature did, and we put a, I can use the term lockbox in the legislation to say that these savings are reserved just for this purpose and no other? Do I have a high degree of confidence that that's going to work and we're going to be able to keep this money for its stated purpose, providing community programs?
No.
Not a high degree of confidence, but it's something we need to continue to be vigilant about and work on, because that was the intent of the work group's recommendations. That was the intent of the legislation, to have that money invested in community programs. The problem is, particularly in rural communities in Kansas, what the work group clearly found was there's a disparity, there's just a dearth, there's just a lack of these community programs. I mean, we have a lot of these community programs in Johnson County. They have them in Sedgwick County, in Wichita. But we don't have nearly enough of these alternatives in rural communities, smaller communities. So that quite often kids were being sent out to the YRCs or even to the correctional facilities by default because there was nothing else to do with them. That's why we need this money for community programs, so they can be, again, effectively treated close to home. And again, we're talking about nonviolent offenders. Now, I've referred a lot of, as we've gone along, about nonviolent offenders, low-risk individuals. How do we determine that? Well, that's also in the legislation. There are things called risk assessment tools, and I won't go into the weeds on this, but risk assessment tools are now required by this legislation to be used 2 times. The first time to determine whether the juvenile is going to be detained in a juvenile facility prior to his juvenile hearing. And then there's another risk assessment tool to determine disposition. How, you know, what's the sentence and what's going to be, where the child's going to be placed. Before 2013, we weren't really effectively and consistently using risk assessment tools anywhere in the state. With some legislation before this legislation that came out of my committee a couple of years ago, we started instituting this risk assessment tool, but it still wasn't really mandatory. This legislation makes the use of those tools mandatory, both at the detention level and at the disposition level, and that's very important. One other important thing we did, and then I'll turn it over to, I think Betsy's going next, and then I can answer more questions about other components of the bill. But the one other important thing that the bill did was change the juvenile sentencing system in Kansas, for the most part, from indeterminate sentences to defined length, determinate sentences. This does not apply to the most serious violent offenders, what we call off-grid offenders or high severity levels. With adults, we have a sentencing grid. For kids, we have basically a sentencing matrix that lists different levels of youth offenders. And prior to this legislation, within those grids, the sentences were indeterminate. There was no definite end time to the period of out-of-home placement or of probation or supervision before the child was released from the juvenile justice system. And the work group found, again, that would be much more effective to have determinate sentences that were commensurate with giving them the services they need, the programs they need. Again, we're talking about the ones we've assessed as low risk, but that ends at a specific period of time. So we have a new matrix in this legislation limiting the amount of time that these kids can be placed out of home, if that's what their sentence is, and limiting their overall time in the juvenile justice system, including their supervision time. And we now have a definite limit on that. Now, if there's a new offense committed during that time, then the clock starts ticking again. But that was another important piece of this legislation. So let me wrap up by saying this bill, Senate Bill 367, the Comprehensive Juvenile Justice Reform Bill in Kansas, I think we all share the view, it has the potential to be a great improvement in how we treat juveniles in Kansas, recognizing that the vast majority of them are not violent criminals that pose a risk to society. And the way to make sure that remains the case is to keep them in as low a level of involvement in the system as possible. One other thing I didn't talk about was mentioned very briefly. We have a school-to-prison pipeline now. In far too many cases in Kansas, schools, because it's the easiest course, have been suspending or expelling kids, and they get involved in with law enforcement when they don't necessarily need to be, and they get into the juvenile justice system, and then it takes off from there. So we're looking at more situations where we can curtail that, have the kids stay in school and not get involved in the criminal justice system in the first place. So all of these things are designed then, and evidence shows that they will be effective and fully implemented to reduce recidivism, reoffending by juvenile offenders, and it is my hope, it is actually my firm belief, that then we're doing the best thing for the kid, turn his or her life around. And at the same time, we're doing the best thing for the people of Kansas, for public safety, by taking these kids and doing everything we can to see that they don't become adult criminal offenders. And that's really the thought behind this legislation. Thanks, and turn it over to Betsy.
Good morning. One of the things that I want to start off with before we get into this side of the topic today is that I'm a big believer in democracy and the election process. And I am also, not only do I work for Johnson County, but I'm serving as a poll worker as well. And so I'm going to be there at 4:30 in the morning on Tuesday, and we'll be staying all through the day until probably 8:30 or more. And I'm sure that probably some of you are going to do the same, but believe very much in that process. Representative Rubin has done a great job in outlining what the state has been doing on juvenile justice reform. One of the things that I want to start out talking to you about is Johnson County's plans for improving juvenile justice. And I'm going to say proudly that Johnson County has been the leader in the state in trying to reform juvenile justice from the beginning. And I will tell you that when I started my role here in Johnson County in 2007, our juvenile detention facility, which is located in Olathe off of Spruce Street, was over its capacity. We had a capacity of 70 beds, and it was over that, and we were sending kids to other detention facilities in the state of Kansas, paying the other detention facilities to take those, transporting them across the state, and then separating them from their families while the court process was still going on. And so, there were days when we reached a high of 85 youth in that detention capacity. So in 2007, just after I came, the county commission approved the building of additional beds in Johnson County to be able to keep those youth in Johnson County since the capacity was so high. Well, at that time, little had been spoken about juvenile justice reform. Just thought, oh, well, you have the need for the beds, let's build some more. So we did. However, we built them right. We made those beds in the new Youth and Family Services Center, 33 of those beds, to be less traumatic. It didn't look like a jail. It was very warm and an environment in which we could at least work with the youth when they were there. And we had 33 additional beds. Well, then came 2008, and led by the then chair of the Johnson County Commission, Annabeth Serbaugh, we formed the Johnson County Criminal Justice Advisory Council, something that is a best practice in the nation to have your stakeholders sit down and community members sit down and talk about what's going on in your county and then trying to make suggestions for improvements. As Annabeth Serbaugh had seen, we were building a whole lot of jail beds for adults, a whole lot of those, and then also, of course, the juvenile edition. So she recognized we got to stop this somehow. What can we do to change that trajectory? And so that council was formed. And one of the first things that the council decided to do was to study the juvenile side. Why? Because we want to try to catch them before they get into that adult side. That's probably the best place to start. So we studied our juvenile system locally, what was going on there, flow charts out all over the room. And we also learned about an initiative that was going on in other states that was sponsored by the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and that was the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative. So we said, okay, we want to pursue that in Johnson County. So we asked the Annie E. Casey Foundation, would you take us? We'd like to be sponsored and to improve services here in Johnson County. Well, they refused to do so. Why? Because it had become so expansive, they could no longer take on an individual county. So what they needed to do, they said, they'll take on the state of Kansas, but they're not going to just take on Johnson County. So then we had to go to the state and convince the Juvenile Justice Commissioner, Russ Jennings at the time, to help us. Can you get some other counties to come on board and do this with us? I had formerly been with Shawnee County and was over juvenile detention there, so I kind of had them in my pocket. They were going to help. Well, he went out and talked to Wyandotte County, he talked to Sedgwick and Douglas counties, and they all agreed to come on. So we have 5 counties in the state participating in the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative that represented 75% of the juvenile detention beds in the state, which was pretty much for the majority there. So we knew we could have an impact. And so the Casey Foundation, after much work with us from the beginning, started their work. We started officially in December of 2011. And I did have a handout there for you if you want to refer to that just real quickly. You'll see on the map all the states that are actually, the state sites are in green. That means all those states are doing this JDI, that's a short, brief way to call it, as part of the whole state. There are other states there that have county sites only. They're not participating on a large scale, which are the yellow ones. And then you can see Utah is interested. They may do it. Now, what's wrong with Oklahoma, Colorado, some of those other states, I don't know. They need to be convinced because it is a very helpful alternative. And so that's, and I'm not going to go over the bullet points on there, but that tells you also what the core strategies of JDI are. We want to decrease the number of youth unnecessarily or inappropriately detained. And all of those going down the list there. And so Annie E. Casey came in, and we had to pull up a lot of data. That was the first way they told us to do it. Examine your data. Who's in your detention centers? Well, one of the things we found out, people that were in detention centers were kids that were on probation violations, technical probation violations, and they were one of the largest groups. So that was something that I had control over, and the courts had control over, because we had kids, those were our staff that were putting them in there. So we started working on that, and we reduced that number pretty significantly right away. And so, but anyway, I think if you want to turn over to the backside, this is one thing we're very proud of, is that back in 2006, our average daily population was 69.3, and in 2016, through the end of October, it's down to 18.7. And I can tell you that there are some days when we have as low as 8 kids in juvenile detention, and that's wonderful. So we've made a lot of progress on that, and much of that was done through a local collaborative planning group. We had to have the stakeholders at the table, and it wasn't an easy process. I can tell you, they were a lot of almost defensiveness when we first started looking at this. We had, Judge Foster wasn't doing the juvenile docket at that time, but the judge who was, was a little offended because, we're trying to come in and say we're putting kids unnecessarily in detention and so forth. And even the district attorney's office was, scratching their heads. Well, I thought we were doing a pretty good job. And they were in many cases, but again, we could always improve. We could always do better. So it took a while to get used to all of that and to get heads wrapped around that and to buy into the entire process. Now, one of the things too that John Rubin has mentioned is that we were at the time also placing a lot of youth in those youth residential centers too, and group homes and so forth out there. And they were having some pretty lengthy stays in some of those. We had some that were there a year or more. And so we knew that that was a problem. We always knew, because they were being successful in there, but it was kind of like, what else do we do with them? Why were we putting them there? Well, I can tell you a big part of that was the parents. Even though they had parents, they were tired. They were frustrated with dealing with them. They wanted us to just take them away and give them a break, basically, a lot of times. And of course, some come along the way. They had committed some crimes, but mostly minor offenses. And then that's what the staff had been trained to do. You know, they were placed in custody, and we were supposed to be taking care of them now. They were our responsibility if they were in our custody. So we did it, but we knew those placements were ineffective. And so when the juvenile detention population went down, all of a sudden, guess what? We didn't need those new 33 beds for detention anymore. We could house all the kids on the former detention facility on the other side of the street. So then we said, well, what are we going to do with our 33 beds? It's a beautiful facility. If you haven't seen it, it's gorgeous. And it was here to try to treat and help youth and not traumatize them further. So we knew we needed to do something with those beds. There were many ideas for how we might be able to use those beds, but the state wanted us to start our own youth residential center so we could house them here in Johnson County. And so they were excited because they knew the other ones were very ineffective. Keep in mind, at that time, this was late 2014, the juvenile justice reform hadn't started yet, okay? And so we started working on changing those beds to a youth residential facility. We opened that facility in February 2015. And and quite frankly, we got lots of referrals. We had a lot of youth in there. But what we determined to do differently, we were going to provide programming for these kids. We wanted to see them succeed. It wasn't just to be a place to house the kids. So we brought in, we did a partnership with mental health and brought in functional family therapy. We had cognitive programming. We had substance abuse programming. We literally had it all, okay? But, and I will tell you that John Rubin has referred to the statistics about the YRC2s being very poor. Ours was not in those statistics. We were not in existence at the time those were.
That's right.
But the problem is, we knew the kids that were staying there were doing pretty good. We had great successes with many of those. However, the way the regulations are built on a youth residential center too, we can't lock the doors. We cannot lock the doors. That's why they were running away. Can't restrain them, can't lock the doors. So they impulsive kids were running away. So if we felt like if we could have kept them there and locked the doors, we might have had some success. But that didn't work. So after juvenile justice reform was passed and so forth, we started looking at our population, and it was going down because we all knew it was coming. They wanted a reduction in out-of-home placements. Judge Foster, the other juvenile judges in Johnson County, were not placing kids in custody as much as they had been in the past. So it was a natural decline. So by the time July of 2016, we only had 5 youth in that program. So we said it's not effective to keep a program open for only 5 youth. So we shut that down. And we've done some other things with those beds since, which I will talk about today. But anyway, the numerous changes within Senate Bill 367 I do support. I testified in support of this when it was before the legislature, although I did recommend a few tweaks. And they did listen to me a few times here, and we did say there are kids that you'll never be able to successfully keep in the community with their parents because they don't have a home to go to. And so those are rare few, but we needed to have something for those. So they listed and they ended up with 50 beds. But we also started looking at our local programming. What are we going to do to make them more successful in the community? And so we took the lead for the eastern region of the state, which includes 14 other counties. And we have started a program, a contract with a program called Youth Advocate Programs Incorporated. And this is a program that has been in existence for 40 years throughout the nation, started in Pennsylvania. And they hire, what they do for us, I'm going to refer to it as YAP, because that's the abbreviation. Youth Advocate Programs is YAP. So with that program, they hire advocates to work with kids in the community and their families, okay? So what they do is they hire these advocates, they vet them, background checks, and they try to hire these advocates that are in the same areas where these kids live, okay? So they can relate to the youth as best they can. Then they train them how to work with them, how to get them into resources and so forth. And they work with them intensively for about 12 and a half hours a week. Okay, they're paid, and in Johnson County, they're hiring them in at $14 an hour. And most of the people that are filling those slots are professionals. Okay, they may be retired professionals, or they may be police officers or teachers who want to help out and do something on the side and earn a little money on the side while they're doing that. Beauty of this is it's less cost than those youth residential centers. Right now, the state pays to those youth residential centers for every day of stay for one youth, $126 a day. Okay? This program in Johnson County, and is being used and also in Wyandotte, and we're starting in some other counties, is costing $54.17 today, per day. So less than half of what those out-of-home costs were. But it's very intensive and goes on for about 4 months is what they're working with those, very intensively. We just started this in October, and we have 5 youth now assigned to that program, and they're all doing very well. And then we've also, because of our increased caseload sizes, nationally, juvenile crime's downhill, but also because JDI. We've been doing JDI in Johnson County. We have taken some of our staff that were formerly those people that were managing those kids that were placed in custody and sent to those YRC2s, and we're changing those to program providers. We're training them how to deliver programming in the community. No additional money, just switching their roles. And so we're screening, first step is screening into the appropriate programs, and then getting them into the training they need. Cognitive behavioral programs. We're evidence-based. They all need to be evidence-based, or we're not going to do them. So currently, we're doing moral recognition therapy, which is a cognitive-based therapy. Our staff are being trained now to do regression replacement training, common sense parenting, and as what I said before, we already have functional family therapy, multi-systemic therapy, an evening reporting program here in Johnson County, and sex offender counseling. So we are trying to do our best to make sure that we're filling those needs in the community for programming. So implementation of the provisions of Senate Bill 367 has been very challenging. We have a dual system of supervision in Kansas. We have the Office of Judicial Administration, court services run by the state that does supervise juveniles in the community, as well as community corrections, which is funded through the Kansas Department of Corrections. And so there's been territorialism for many years regarding that. People, you know, and if you've ever heard of proposals for consolidation of field services, those are never met very well because there's a lot of ownership on their own programs. So that's been part of the problem in trying to implement, but we're working together with OJA and KDOC to try to work through those issues. There are 3 state groups that are working on the earned discharge and probation practices of that Senate Bill 367. That's one group, equal OJA, equal KDOC or community corrections, and then immediate intervention programs. All counties in the state are now required to have what that's actually a big term for diversion. And so we're going to have intermediate intervention programs. Fortunately, Johnson County has been doing diversion for a long time, so we're going to be ahead of the game on that. And then who's going to supervise who? That risk assessment that John told you about, we need to know at what point on the risk scale do they need to go to more intensive supervision with community corrections and or be supervised under less intensive supervision with court services, probation officers. So those are all being decided at the state level, and I am serving on the cutoff scores work group myself. Other changes, probation periods, not just sentences, but probation periods are going to be shorter. We used to be able to extend those for a significant amount of time, so not going to be able to do that. They're going to have shorter periods. We're not going to be able to revoke our probation clients unless it's the 3rd or subsequent technical violation. Okay? So it's making it a little bit more difficult. We're going to have to step back and do more things in the community beforehand. It's a good thing. And the lengths of sentences in the state facilities, he's already mentioned. One of the things that I really think is something yet we've got to work on is with our school districts. And we're putting together through JDI group this year called the School to Prison Pipeline Work Group. We actually had one somewhat last year, but we're going to revamp it this year because we see a lot of issues coming through truancy. Truancy can lead to further involvement in the justice system and expulsions and suspensions. And I can tell you, you talk to each school district, it's all a little different. Everything looks a little different. And I think one of the things I'm most concerned about is due process in the suspension and expulsion process. And so we're going to be looking at all of those kinds of things through that committee. And then I just in general want to say, the state took this large-scale approach to juvenile justice reform. And there are some who could say, well, maybe it should have been just done in pieces. I think that's probably the way we all would have preferred it. But would it have all gotten there and would we see successes quickly? Probably not. So, but here's the part that has to happen in the local communities, is that you've got to have the staff who are working with these kids buy in. If they don't understand why we're doing this and agree that it's needed, then we're not going to have those successes. So, and I think you're seeing different degrees of acceptance throughout the state of Kansas. I have been working with our staff, telling them what we're hearing out of that juvenile justice work group, presenting much of the same information that they receive from the Pew Foundation and so forth. And so they understand it. It's still a big change. They've got to change the way they think, okay? And so they're working on it, but it is still a struggle. We did see a reduction locally in our out-of-home placements, I've already said. At one time, our YRC2s, we had 20 or more kids out in some other place in this state in a youth residential center. Right now, we're down to 7 in youth residential centers right now, and we're talking about those kids every day. Can we get them out? How can we bring them back? And there are some of those kids that have no homes to go to. There are some of those kids that are over the age of 18. And we're going to really be working with them to try to get them into independent living because they have no home to go to. So again, we're going to continue to do that. We're going to also, with that transitional living, they built into this bill a community reintegration program. So KDOC is going to lead that, and they're going to start say, okay, if you want to try to get a youth into the community living independently, we'll provide so much for the first months of rent. We'll help support that, and then it'll gradually trail off to where the youth then is working and can provide for his or her own support. So we're doing that as well. So I guess I'm going to leave some time here for Judge Foster, but I think
1 minute.
overall, 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 we've done a very good job in recognizing the need to make changes to our juvenile justice system in Kansas. I'm proud that Johnson County has taken the lead on that, and we continue to do so. And so we're supportive of all these changes, and we want to see our youth be successful in the community. So I thank them for what they have done for the law changes, and we're just going to continue to plow through and hopefully make these kids successful.